Hey everybody, today we're going to cover the results from yesterday, August 13th. We've got 4 states that had primaries, and we also did a more than 4.5 hour stream last night, so thanks to everybody that showed up. So as always, we're going to go through these results and we're just going to hit the highlights. And keep in mind, some vote could still be trickling in, but for the most part, these states did a good job getting the vote in. So we'll start here in Minnesota. First for the U.S. Senate, we've got Amy Klobuchar, the Democratic incumbent. She's going to be the nominee again, and no surprise there. She only had token opposition, but on the Republican side, the winner is Royce White over Joe Frazier. He's the former NBA player, and it was actually Joe Frazier that seemingly had a little bit of an advantage going into this election. And it seems like Frazier was considered the more moderate candidate, but White pulls it out. There's no runoff, so he got about 38.5% of the vote, but White is going to go up against Klobuchar. Either way, Klobuchar would be heavily favored to win re-election, probably by more than 10 to 15 points. Then we had the most high-profile race for the Democrats. This is the 5th district. It's in the Twin Cities, represented by Ilhan Omar. She was facing a rematch in her primary against Don Samuels. She only won by 2 points just 2 years ago, but at the rematch, it was a much more comfortable win. Omar easily has a double-digit advantage, so in November, she's expected to cruise to re-election. Now, there's no governor's race this year in Minnesota, but the rest of the 8 U.S. House districts are here on this table. There wasn't really anything that exciting. Some people might point to the 7th district on the Republican side with Michelle Fischbach. She won by a margin that might not be extremely convincing. It was about 30 points. Most of these races are either uncontested or only have token opposition. So that's Minnesota. Let's move on to the neighboring state of Wisconsin. For the U.S. Senate, as expected on the Republican side, the winner is Eric Hovde. He's at 86% of the vote. His opposition was insignificant, so Hovde is going to go on to face incumbent Tammy Baldwin in November. Hovde previously ran 12 years ago, so this time he's going at it again. I'm not somebody who thinks Hovde is a super strong candidate. We'll see what happens, but Baldwin should start off with the advantage. A couple specific races to take a look at are in the 3rd Congressional District. For the Democrats, they had a competitive primary. The winner is Rebecca Cook over Katrina Shankland. It looks like Cook is the little bit more moderate candidate, so it's about a 9-point win for her. Cook was also the runner-up in that primary just 2 years ago, so she's going to go on to face incumbent Republican Derek Van Orden. Van Orden is currently in his first term. He might be considered a little bit more controversial, and 2 years ago he won by less than a 4-point margin, so it could be close in November, but Van Orden should have at least a slight edge. Then we can move on to the 8th district, and this is going to be an open seat to replace Republican Mike Gallagher, who already resigned from Congress. So there's actually a special election to fill the remainder of his term, which expires in January, and then there's also the primary for the term that begins in January. Either way, it's a 3-way race, but the winner was Tony Weed. He was endorsed by Donald Trump, and he got about 43.5% of the vote. He beat 2 other politicians in Roger Roth and Andre Jacques. So it looks like in this race, the Trump endorsement actually had enough sway. Now, the district is fairly red, but in the general election, he's going to go on to face Kristen Lyerly. And in the primary for the next term, it's almost the same result. Again, Tony Weed is that nominee. Now, the rest of the 8 U.S. House seats are on this table, but there's nothing really too dramatic to point out. But there are also 2 statewide ballot measures to amend the Constitution. Here's the first one here, and both of these did fail by nearly the same margin. Now, the topic of these is basically centered around the governor and the state legislators' authority when it comes to spending certain federal funds. Generally, the Democrats were in favor of a no vote, while Republicans were in favor of a yes. And considering both of these failed by 15-point margins, it looks like Democrats are going to be celebrating. Now, the money spent on these was almost entirely in the no direction, so it's possible that was a factor, but I would also guess there's some people out there that would not understand what voting for yes would actually change, so they just defaulted and voted for no. And it's also entirely possible this was just an unpopular proposal. Either way, that's Wisconsin. Now we can move on to Connecticut. In the U.S. Senate election for the GOP, the nominee is going to be Matthew Corey. He prevailed over Jerry Smith by about 9 points. He's going to go on to face Chris Murphy in November, where Murphy is heavily favored. And then we could go down here to the 5 U.S. House districts, and every one of them was uncontested on both sides except the 4th district with the Republicans. The winner there was Michael Goldstein over Bob McGuffey. It was close, but Goldstein is going to go on to the general election and take on incumbent Jim Himes. The primary is not all that important because Himes is expected to win rather comfortably. The only district that could be competitive is the 5th, and that is going to be a rematch between incumbent Democrat Johanna Hayes and George Logan. Hayes won by less than 1% 2 years ago. Finally, we can move on to Vermont. For governor, the Democrats nominated Esther Charleston as their nominee. She's going to go on to face incumbent Republican Phil Scott, who's running for his 5th term. It's a very blue state, but Phil Scott has remained extremely popular as a liberal Republican. The other race to look at here would be for lieutenant governor. And incumbent progressive slash Democrat David Zuckerman faced a challenge from Thomas Renner. Zuckerman won by more than 20 points, so he's going to go on to the general election where he's going to face Republican John Rogers, who won by a similar margin over Gregory Thayer. Rogers is considered much more moderate, so in theory this could be a little bit more of a competitive election, but I would still expect Zuckerman to be heavily favored. After that, we can move on to the other statewide races, but there's really not much to take a look at because every single one of them was uncontested on both sides. That includes for the U.S. Senate, where Bernie Sanders is going to face Gerald Malloy. Malloy was the nominee for the Republicans 2 years ago. Democrats are expected to easily win every one of these seats unless something crazy happens, so there's really not a whole lot to point out, but that pretty much covers the highlights for these primary results. And if you're looking for the upcoming schedule, we've got it right here. Next week there are primaries in Alaska, Florida, and Wyoming, plus the DNC convention is coming up as well. Then in early September we finish up the remaining primaries. But that's it for now, so let me know in the comments, what do you think about any of these results? Are you surprised about Royce White or Ilhan Omar in Minnesota? How about Tony Weed in Wisconsin? And what do you think about Eric Hovde's chances? And anything you're taking note of in Connecticut or Vermont, let me know down below. On your way out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.